There are acts of cruelty so profound that they seem to echo through time itself. On a cotton plantation in rural Georgia, December 1854, an overseer named Silas Hargrove committed such an act. What happened in the 23 days that followed his final display of contempt has never been fully explained by historians who've examined the plantation records. 7 people witnessed his death. None could agree on what they saw. The county coroner's report, filed on December 26, 1854, contains a single word crossed out so violently that the pen tore through the paper. Beneath it, someone wrote in different ink, "Natural causes." But the photographs taken of Hargrove's body, rare for that era, tell a different story. His neck bore marks that the doctor couldn't explain, concentrated in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. Before we continue with the story of Silas Hargrove and the Thornhill Plantation, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because stories like this one, buried in forgotten archives and sealed county records, don't surface often. And I want to know, where are you listening from right now? Drop your state or city in the comments. You might be closer to places like this than you think. The Thornhill Plantation sat in the low country of Georgia, where the Ogeechee River carved through red clay and pine forests. By 1854, it had grown into one of the most profitable cotton operations in the region, spanning nearly 2,000 acres and employing over 140 enslaved people. The plantation house itself was a monument to wealth extracted from suffering. 3 stories of white columns and wraparound porches visible for miles across the flat fields. Spanish moss hung from the live oaks that lined the long drive leading to the main house, creating shadows that shifted and moved with every breeze. Edmund Thornhill had inherited the plantation from his father in 1848. He was a man of 35, educated at the College of Charleston, with business interests that extended beyond cotton into shipping and banking. He spent most of his time in Savannah, leaving the day-to-day operations of the plantation to his overseer. Thornhill prided himself on being a modern plantation owner, one who understood efficiency and profit margins. He kept meticulous records, tracking every bale of cotton, every pound of seed, every expense down to the penny. But he had little interest in the human cost of his wealth. The enslaved people who worked his land were, to him, simply assets in a ledger, their value measured in productivity and replacement cost. Silas Hargrove had arrived at Thornhill in the spring of 1852, hired by Edmund Thornhill after the previous overseer had died of yellow fever. Hargrove came with references from plantations in South Carolina and Alabama, each letter praising his ability to maintain order and maximize productivity. He was a compact man, no taller than 5 feet 7 inches, with a face weathered by sun and a voice that carried across the fields like a whip crack. His eyes were a pale gray, cold and assessing, always calculating. He dressed in the practical clothes of his station, rough cotton shirts, wool trousers, heavy boots, but he carried himself with an authority that demanded obedience. The enslaved community learned quickly that Hargrove's cruelty wasn't explosive or unpredictable. It was methodical, calculated, designed to break spirits as efficiently as possible. He believed that fear was the most effective tool for maintaining control, and he wielded it with precision. A man who worked too slowly would find his food rations cut. A woman who spoke back would be assigned the hardest, most degrading tasks. Children who cried were separated from their mothers. Hargrove understood that physical punishment left marks that could reduce a person's value, so he preferred psychological torment, the kind that left no visible scars but broke people from the inside out. Among those who worked the cotton fields was a woman named Ruth. She was 38 years old in the autumn of 1854, though she looked a decade older. The years of labor had bent her back and gnarled her hands, but her eyes remained sharp and intelligent. Ruth had been born on the plantation, as had her mother before her. She'd spent her entire life within the boundaries of Thornhill land, never traveling more than 10 miles from the place of her birth. She worked as a field hand, rising before dawn to pick cotton until her fingers bled, her back screaming with pain, her body pushed beyond what seemed humanly possible. But Ruth was more than just a field hand. She also served as an unofficial healer for the enslaved community, using knowledge passed down through generations: herbs for fever, poultices for wounds, teas that could ease pain or help a woman through childbirth. Her mother had been a healer, and her grandmother before that, the knowledge traveling across the ocean from Africa, adapting to new plants and new circumstances. Ruth knew which bark could bring down a fever, which roots could stop bleeding, which leaves could ease the pain of a difficult birth. She knew how to set a broken bone, how to treat burns, how to recognize the signs of infection before it turned deadly. This knowledge made her valuable to the enslaved community, a source of hope and comfort in a world designed to strip away both. When a child fell ill, it was Ruth they called for. When a woman went into labor, Ruth was there to guide the baby into the world. When a man injured himself in the fields, Ruth knew how to keep the wound from festering. She worked quietly, never drawing attention to herself, never claiming credit or seeking recognition. She simply did what needed to be done, using the knowledge that had been entrusted to her. But this same knowledge made her dangerous in Hargrove's eyes. He distrusted anything he couldn't control, and Ruth's influence among the other enslaved people represented a kind of power that existed outside his authority. When people looked to Ruth for help, they weren't looking to him. When Ruth eased someone's suffering, it reminded them that there was still kindness in the world, still humanity, still something worth preserving. Hargrove couldn't tolerate that. He needed the enslaved people to be completely dependent on him, to see him as the sole source of mercy or punishment. Ruth's very existence challenged that control. The tension between Ruth and Hargrove had been building for months, a slow accumulation of small cruelties and quiet resistance. In August, he had ordered her whipped for insolence, after she'd asked permission to tend to a sick child instead of working the fields. The child had been burning with fever, delirious and crying for her mother, but Hargrove had refused. "The cotton doesn't pick itself," he'd said. Ruth had gone to the child anyway, spending the night cooling her fever and keeping her alive. The next morning, Hargrove had her tied to the whipping post and gave her 10 lashes. Ruth had endured it in silence, her face expressionless, her body rigid. She didn't cry out, didn't beg for mercy, didn't give Hargrove the satisfaction of seeing her broken. When it was over, she'd walked back to her cabin with her head held high, blood seeping through the back of her dress. In September, Hargrove had destroyed Ruth's small garden, a patch of medicinal herbs she'd cultivated behind her cabin. She'd spent years developing that garden, carefully nurturing plants that could help her community. There was feverfew for headaches, willow bark for pain, chamomile for sleep, yarrow to stop bleeding, comfrey for broken bones. Each plant had been chosen carefully, tended with love, a small act of resistance against the brutality of plantation life. Hargrove had discovered the garden during one of his inspections and had immediately ordered it destroyed. Unsanctioned activity, he'd called it, though everyone knew the real reason. He couldn't stand the idea of Ruth having something of her own, something that brought good into the world without his permission. Ruth had watched in silence as 2 field hands, acting under Hargrove's orders, tore up her garden. They'd pulled the plants out by the roots, trampled them into the dirt, destroyed years of careful cultivation in a matter of minutes. The men doing the work had tears in their eyes. They knew what the garden meant, knew how many people Ruth had helped with those plants. But they had no choice. To refuse would mean punishment, possibly death. So they destroyed the garden while Ruth watched, her face a mask of calm that revealed nothing of what she felt inside. After that, something changed in Ruth. She became quieter, more withdrawn. She still did her work, still helped those who came to her for healing, but there was a distance to her now, as if she'd retreated to some place deep inside herself where Hargrove couldn't reach. The other enslaved people noticed the change and worried. Ruth had always been a source of strength, someone who could endure anything and still find reasons to hope. But now that hope seemed to be fading, replaced by something harder and colder. There was another person on the plantation who noticed Ruth's transformation. A young woman named Dinah. She was 19 years old, born on a neighboring plantation, and sold to Thornhill 2 years earlier when her previous owner had died and his estate was liquidated. Dinah worked in the fields alongside Ruth, and over time, Ruth had begun teaching her the healing arts. Dinah had a natural talent for it. She could remember which plants did what, could identify herbs by sight and smell, had gentle hands that could soothe pain. Ruth had recognized this gift and had begun passing on her knowledge, teaching Dinah everything she knew. But after the destruction of the garden, Ruth had stopped teaching. When Dinah asked questions, Ruth would answer briefly and then fall silent. When Dinah tried to talk about the future, about continuing the healing work, Ruth would change the subject. It was as if Ruth had given up on the idea that there would be a future worth planning for. Dinah wasn't the only one who noticed changes on the plantation that autumn. Joseph, the house slave who served Hargrove his meals and maintained his cabin, had observed something troubling about the overseer. Hargrove had always been cruel, but his cruelty had been controlled, purposeful. Lately, though, there was an edge to him, a barely contained rage that seemed ready to explode at any moment. He would fly into rages over minor infractions, screaming at workers for imagined offenses. He'd become paranoid, convinced that the enslaved people were plotting against him, that they were deliberately working slowly or sabotaging equipment. Joseph had worked as a house slave for most of his life. He was 52 years old, gray-haired and stooped, with the careful, deferential manner of someone who'd learned to survive by making himself invisible. He'd served the previous overseer and had seen many things in his years at Thornhill. But he'd never seen an overseer quite like Hargrove. There was something unstable about the man, something that suggested he was capable of violence beyond the normal brutality of plantation life. In late November, Joseph had witnessed something that disturbed him deeply. He'd been cleaning Hargrove's cabin when he'd found a journal, left open on the desk. Joseph could read, a dangerous skill for an enslaved person, one he kept carefully hidden, and his eyes had fallen on the open page before he could stop himself. The entry was dated November 20th, and it read, "The woman Ruth continues to defy me through her very existence. She thinks her silence is strength, but I will break her. I will make an example of her that will be remembered for generations. They will learn that there is no power here but mine." Joseph had quickly closed the journal and finished his cleaning, his hands shaking. He knew he should warn Ruth, but what could he say? What could she do? They were all trapped in this system, all subject to Hargrove's whims. Warning. Ruth might only make things worse, might draw Hargrove's attention to Joseph himself. So Joseph had said nothing, carrying the knowledge like a weight in his chest, waiting for whatever was coming. By early December, Ruth had fallen ill. The sickness came on suddenly, a fever that burned through her body, accompanied by a cough that racked her frame. Some said it was pneumonia, common enough in the damp Georgia winter. Others whispered it was consumption, the wasting disease that had killed so many. A few of the older women, those who remembered Africa or had heard stories from their mothers, spoke in hushed tones about different causes. They said Ruth had been working herself to death, that the destruction of her garden had broken something inside her, that she'd lost the will to fight. Whatever the cause, Ruth grew weaker by the day. Her fever spiked and fell, leaving her drenched in sweat and shivering with chills. Her cough became worse, bringing up blood that stained the rags she held to her mouth. She could barely stand, let alone work, but Hargrove refused to excuse her from the fields. "She's faking," he told the other workers. "She thinks she can avoid work by pretending to be sick. But I know better." Dinah tried to care for Ruth as best she could. She brought her water, tried to get her to eat, sat with her through the long nights when the fever was at its worst. But without the herbs from Ruth's destroyed garden, there was little Dinah could do. She tried to remember Ruth's teachings, tried to find the plants she needed growing wild around the plantation, but it was winter, and most of the plants were dormant. The few remedies Dinah could cobble together were weak and ineffective against Ruth's illness. Other women from the quarters took turns sitting with Ruth, offering what comfort they could. They brought her extra blankets, shared their meager food rations, prayed over her in whispered voices. But everyone could see that Ruth was dying. The fever was consuming her from the inside out, burning away the strength that had sustained her through decades of brutality and suffering. December 3rd, 1854, dawned cold and gray. A thin frost covered the ground, unusual for Georgia but not unheard of. The temperature had dropped overnight, and a bitter wind blew in from the north, cutting through thin clothing and making everyone miserable. The enslaved workers gathered at dawn, as they did every morning, waiting for Hargrove to assign the day's tasks. They stood in loose groups, stamping their feet against the cold, breath misting in the frigid air. Ruth was among them, though she could barely stand. Dinah and another woman were supporting her, one on each side, practically holding her upright. Ruth had wrapped herself in a thin blanket, but it did little against the cold. Her face was flushed with fever, her eyes glassy and unfocused. She swayed on her feet, her breath coming in shallow, labored gasps that turned to white vapor in the cold air. Hargrove emerged from his cabin, a small structure near the main house that served as his office and living quarters. He carried his ever-present riding crop and a ledger book where he recorded each day's cotton weights. His breath steamed in the cold air as he looked over the assembled workers, counting heads, assessing their readiness for the day's labor. When his gaze fell on Ruth, his expression hardened into something ugly and vindictive. "You," he said, pointing the crop at her. "You're still here." Ruth lifted her head with visible effort. Her eyes were glassy with fever, but she met his gaze. There was no defiance in her look, no challenge, just a weary acceptance of whatever was coming. "I can work," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, each word an effort. "You're worthless," Hargrove said. He walked toward her, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. "You've been worthless for weeks, eating food, taking up space, contributing nothing. You're a drain on this plantation's resources." Ruth said nothing. She simply stood there, swaying slightly between the two women supporting her, the blanket clutched around her shoulders with trembling hands. Hargrove stopped directly in front of her. The other workers had gone silent, watching. Everyone knew what was coming. They'd seen Hargrove's rages before, seen how he used humiliation as a weapon, how he seemed to take pleasure in breaking people down. But what happened next went beyond even his usual cruelty. "You think you're special," Hargrove said, his voice low and venomous. He leaned in close, so close that Ruth could smell the coffee on his breath, the tobacco he chewed. "You think your roots and your herbs make you important. You think people need you, but you're nothing. You hear me? Nothing. You're a piece of property and not even a valuable one. You're used up, worn out, worthless." Ruth's legs gave out. She collapsed to her knees, the blanket falling away from her shoulders. The two women tried to hold her up, but Ruth's weight was too much. She ended up on her hands and knees in the frost, her body shaking with the effort of holding herself up. A coughing fit seized her, violent spasms that shook her entire frame. Blood flecked her lips, dark against her fever-flushed skin. Hargrove looked down at her, and for a moment something flickered across his face. Not pity or compassion, but a kind of satisfaction, as if he'd finally achieved what he'd been working toward. He'd broken her. After months of resistance, months of quiet defiance, he'd finally reduced Ruth to this, a sick woman on her hands and knees in the dirt, coughing up blood, unable even to stand. Then, deliberately with full awareness of what he was doing, Hargrove spat. The glob of saliva landed on the back of Ruth's neck, just below her hairline, sliding down beneath the collar of her dress. It was an act of such profound contempt, such complete dehumanization, that several of the watching workers gasped audibly. In a world full of cruelty, this stood out as something worse, something that crossed a line that even slavery's brutality usually respected. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. The wind died down, leaving the air still and cold. Ruth remained on her hands and knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps, blood dripping from her mouth onto the frost-covered ground. Slowly, with tremendous effort, she lifted her head and looked up at Hargrove. Her eyes, despite the fever, were clear and focused. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The look she gave him contained something that made several of the watching workers step back involuntarily. It wasn't anger or hatred. It was something deeper, something older, something that seemed to look right through Hargrove and see everything he was and everything he would become. It was a look that said, "I see you, I know you, and there will be a reckoning." Hargrove felt something cold run down his spine. For just a moment he was afraid. Then he shook it off, angry at himself for being unsettled by a dying slave woman. "Get her out of my sight," he said to no one in particular, his voice harsher than he'd intended. "Put her in her cabin. If she's not working by tomorrow, she doesn't eat." Two women, Dinah and an older woman named Sarah, helped Ruth to her feet and half-carried her back to the slave quarters, a collection of rough wooden cabins arranged in 2 rows behind the main plantation house. The cabins were simple structures, built from rough-hewn logs with gaps between the boards that let in wind and rain. Each cabin housed multiple families, with thin walls providing minimal privacy. Ruth had a small space in one corner of a cabin she shared with 5 other women, just enough room for a narrow cot and a small trunk where she kept her few possessions. They laid Ruth on the cot, covered her with what blankets they could spare, and tried to make her comfortable. But it was clear that comfort was beyond reach now. Ruth's fever had spiked. Her skin was burning to the touch, hot enough that it hurt to hold her hand. She'd begun to shake with chills despite the blankets, her teeth chattering, her body convulsing with tremors. The cough had gotten worse, each spasm bringing up more blood. Word spread quickly through the quarters about what had happened. People came to see Ruth, to offer what comfort they could, to bear witness to her suffering. The cabin filled with women, their faces grim, their voices low. They knew Ruth was dying. They'd seen death often enough to recognize its approach, but this felt different, more significant somehow. Ruth had been a pillar of their community, someone who'd helped so many people, who'd brought life into the world and eased suffering wherever she could. Her death felt like a loss that would echo far beyond the simple ending of one life. As the day wore on, Ruth drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes she would open her eyes and seem to recognize the people around her, would try to speak, but couldn't find the strength. Other times she would be lost in fever dreams, murmuring words that made no sense, reaching out for things only she could see. Dinah stayed by her side, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with cool water, whispering reassurances that everything would be all right, even though they both knew it wouldn't be. By nightfall, it was clear Ruth was dying. The fever had taken hold completely, and her breathing had become labored and irregular. She would take several quick, shallow breaths, then stop breathing entirely for long seconds before gasping back to life. Her skin had taken on a grayish tinge, and her lips were blue. The women gathered around her bed, holding her hands, touching her face, saying goodbye in the only way they could. Around midnight, something changed. Ruth, who'd been unconscious for hours, suddenly opened her eyes. The woman sitting with her, Dinah, later said that Ruth's eyes were completely clear, as if the fever had momentarily released its grip. Ruth looked around the cabin, seeming to see each person there, really see them, in a way that made them feel known and understood. Then her gaze settled on Dinah. Ruth reached out and grasped Dinah's hand with surprising strength. Her lips moved, and Dinah leaned in close to hear. Ruth's voice was barely a whisper, each word an effort, but her meaning was clear. "Tell them," Ruth whispered, her eyes boring into Dinah's, "that some debts get paid whether you believe in the reckoning or not. Tell them that cruelty has a cost. Tell them that what goes around comes around, one way or another. Tell them to remember." Dinah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'll tell them," she promised. "I'll remember." Ruth's grip relaxed. She closed her eyes and a small smile crossed her face, as if she'd seen something that pleased her, something that brought peace. Her breathing slowed, became regular, almost peaceful. The women around her bed began to pray, their voices rising and falling in the old rhythms, the songs and prayers that had sustained them through generations of suffering. Ruth died just before dawn on December 4th, 1854. As the first grey light began to seep through the cracks in the cabin walls, she took one final breath, let it out slowly, and was gone. The women around her bed fell silent, the prayers dying on their lips. For a long moment no one moved. Then Sarah, the oldest woman there, reached out and gently closed Ruth's eyes. "She's free now," Sarah said quietly. "Whatever comes next, she's free." The enslaved community buried Ruth that same day in the small cemetery at the edge of the plantation, a plot of cleared ground where generations of enslaved people had been laid to rest. There were no headstones, no markers beyond rough wooden crosses that would rot away within a few years. But everyone knew who was buried where, could recite the names and stories of those who'd gone before. The cemetery was one of the few places on the plantation that belonged entirely to the enslaved community, a place where they could gather without white supervision, where they could mourn and remember and hold on to their humanity. The burial was a simple affair. There was no coffin, just Ruth's body wrapped in a clean sheet, the best they could manage. 6 men carried her to the grave, walking slowly, their faces solemn. The entire enslaved community followed, over 100 people processing through the cold December morning. They sang as they walked, the old songs that spoke of freedom and rest and a better world beyond this one. The songs were coded, full of double meanings that the white people on the plantation didn't understand, but that spoke volumes to those who knew how to listen. There was no marker, no ceremony beyond a few whispered prayers and the songs that rose into the grey sky. The men lowered Ruth's body into the red Georgia clay, and everyone took turns throwing handfuls of dirt onto the sheet-wrapped form. Dinah was the last to approach the grave. She stood at the edge, looking down at the shape of Ruth's body beneath the dirt, and spoke quietly. "I'll remember," she said. "I'll tell them. I promise." Edmund Thornhill, the plantation owner, didn't attend the burial. He rarely involved himself in such matters, leaving all details of managing the enslaved workforce to Hargrove. As far as Thornhill was concerned, Ruth's death was simply a matter of accounting, one less worker to feed, one less name in the ledger. He was in Savannah when Ruth died, attending to business matters, and wouldn't return to the plantation for another week. When he did return and learned of Ruth's death, his only comment was to ask Hargrove if her death would significantly impact productivity. Hargrove assured him it wouldn't, but Hargrove attended the burial. He stood at a distance, watching as the simple sheet-wrapped body was lowered into the red Georgia clay. Several people noticed that he seemed agitated, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his hand repeatedly moving to touch the riding crop at his belt. His face was flushed, and he kept touching the back of his neck, scratching at it absently. When the burial was finished and the workers began to disperse, Hargrove called out. "Back to work," he said, his voice carrying across the cemetery. "All of you. Mourning time is over. The cotton doesn't pick itself." There was a moment of hesitation, a collective pause as the enslaved people processed this command. They'd just buried one of their own, had barely finished covering her grave, and already they were being ordered back to work. But they had no choice. Slowly, reluctantly, they began to move toward the fields, leaving Ruth's fresh grave behind. Joseph, who'd been standing at the back of the crowd, noticed something odd as Hargrove turned to leave. The overseer stumbled slightly as if dizzy and put his hand to his forehead. Then he shook his head, straightened up, and walked back toward his cabin with determined strides. But Joseph had seen the momentary weakness, had seen Hargrove touch the back of his neck again, scratching at it with an intensity that seemed almost compulsive. That night, Hargrove complained of a headache. Joseph, who brought his dinner as he did every evening, found the overseer sitting at his desk, staring blankly at the wall. The food Joseph had prepared, fried chicken, cornbread, greens, sat untouched on the plate. Hargrove barely acknowledged Joseph's presence, just waved him away with an irritated gesture. "Are you feeling well, sir?" Joseph asked carefully. "I'm fine," Hargrove snapped. "Just tired. Leave me alone." But Joseph noticed things as he cleaned up the cabin. Hargrove had scratched the back of his neck raw, leaving red welts that looked angry and inflamed. There were scratch marks on the desk where Hargrove had been sitting, as if he'd been digging his nails into the wood. And there was a smell in the cabin, faint but noticeable. Something sour and unpleasant, like sweat and fear. Joseph left quickly, disturbed by what he'd seen. He returned to the slave quarters and found Dinah sitting outside her cabin, staring at nothing. He sat down beside her, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. "He's scratching his neck," Joseph said finally, "right where he spat on Ruth." Dinah turned to look at him, her eyes unreadable in the darkness. "I know," she said quietly. "I saw him doing it at the burial." "You think it means something?" Joseph asked. Dinah was quiet for a long time before answering. "Ruth told me something before she died," she said finally. "She said some debts get paid whether you believe in the reckoning or not. I didn't know what she meant then, but maybe we're about to find out." December 5th began normally enough. Hargrove emerged from his cabin at dawn and assigned the day's work. But those who worked near him noticed changes. He was irritable, more so than usual, snapping at workers for minor infractions. His face was flushed, and he kept touching the back of his neck, scratching at it compulsively. The red welts Joseph had noticed the night before had gotten worse, spreading down beneath his collar. By midday, Hargrove had retreated to his cabin, claiming he needed to update the plantation records. But he didn't update any records. Joseph, who checked on him in the afternoon, found Hargrove sitting at his desk, staring at a blank page in his ledger. The lamp was lit even though it was still daylight, casting long shadows across the room. Hargrove hadn't written anything. He just sat there, one hand absently scratching the back of his neck, staring at the empty page. That evening, Hargrove summoned Joseph to his cabin. When Joseph arrived, he found Hargrove in the same position, still staring at the blank page. The lamp had burned low and the cabin was full of shadows. Hargrove didn't look up when Joseph entered. "Did you hear anything last night?" Hargrove asked without preamble. Joseph, confused, shook his head. "No, sir. Hear what?" "Singing," Hargrove said. "I heard singing, coming from the quarters. A woman's voice, singing those songs you people sing." Joseph felt a chill run down his spine. He knew this was impossible. After Ruth's death, the quarters had been silent. No one had sung. No one had even spoken above a whisper. The grief was too fresh, too raw. But he also knew better than to contradict Hargrove. "I didn't hear nothing, sir," Joseph said carefully. Hargrove finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, and the scratches on his neck had gotten worse, some of them bleeding slightly. "You're lying," he said flatly. "I heard it. A woman singing. It sounded like it was right outside my window, but when I looked, there was no one there." "Maybe it was the wind, sir," Joseph suggested. "It was blowing pretty hard last night." "It wasn't the wind," Hargrove said, his voice rising. "I know what I heard. Someone was singing. Someone was out there watching me." Joseph didn't know what to say. Hargrove was clearly not well. The bloodshot eyes, the scratches, the paranoia. But Joseph also knew that pointing this out would only make things worse. "Would you like me to bring you some food, sir?" Joseph asked, trying to change the subject. "Get out," Hargrove said suddenly. "Get out before I have you whipped for insolence." Joseph left quickly, his heart pounding. He'd served Hargrove for 2 years and had learned to read the overseer's moods, to know when to speak and when to stay silent. But this was different. This was a man coming unraveled, losing his grip on reality. And Joseph had no idea what that might mean for the rest of them. Over the next 3 days, Hargrove's condition deteriorated rapidly. He stopped coming out of his cabin entirely, sending messages through Joseph about work assignments. The scratches on his neck had spread, angry red lines that looked like claw marks running down beneath his collar and up toward his hairline. He complained constantly of headaches, of hearing things, singing, whispers, footsteps outside his cabin at night. On December 6th, Hargrove sent Joseph to fetch Dr. Pritchard, but then changed his mind before Joseph could leave. "No," Hargrove said. "No, doctor. They'll think I'm crazy. It's nothing, just a fever. It'll pass." But it didn't pass. On December 7th, Hargrove refused to eat, claiming the food tasted wrong, that someone was trying to poison him. He accused Joseph of tampering with his meals, of putting something in his water. Joseph denied it, of course, but Hargrove wouldn't listen. From that point on, Hargrove would only eat food that he'd watched Joseph prepare from start to finish, and even then he would barely touch it. The scratches on his neck had become infected. The skin around them was red and swollen, oozing a clear fluid that stained his collar. Hargrove had taken to wearing a scarf wrapped around his neck, trying to hide the marks, but the scarf only made things worse, trapping heat and moisture against the infected skin. On December 8th, Edmund Thornhill finally took notice. He'd been away in Savannah on business and returned to find his overseer essentially incapacitated. The plantation was running, but barely. The enslaved workers were doing their jobs, but without Hargrove's constant supervision, productivity had dropped. Thornhill was annoyed. He was paying Hargrove good money to manage the plantation, and instead, the man was hiding in his cabin, apparently too sick to work. Thornhill visited Hargrove's cabin and was shocked by what he found. Hargrove had lost weight, his face was gaunt, and his eyes had a wild, unfocused quality. The cabin itself was in disarray, papers scattered across the floor, the bed unmade, a smell of sickness in the air. Hargrove was sitting at his desk, the scarf wrapped around his neck, scratching absently at his arms. "Silas," Thornhill said, "you need a doctor." "No," Hargrove said immediately, his voice hoarse. "No doctor, it's nothing, just a fever. It'll pass." "You look terrible," Thornhill said bluntly. "You've lost weight, you're not working, and from what Joseph tells me, you're barely eating. What's wrong with you?" "Nothing's wrong with me," Hargrove insisted. "I'm fine. I just need rest." Thornhill frowned. He walked closer, trying to get a better look at Hargrove. "What's that on your neck? Let me see." "It's nothing," Hargrove said, pulling the scarf tighter. "Just scratches. They'll heal." But Thornhill wasn't satisfied. He reached out and pulled the scarf away before Hargrove could stop him. What he saw made him step back in shock. The scratches had spread across Hargrove's entire neck, angry red lines that wept clear fluid. Some of them had scabbed over, only to be scratched open again. The skin was inflamed and swollen, clearly infected. "Good God, man," Thornhill said. "How did this happen?" "I don't know," Hargrove said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't stop scratching. It itches. It burns. It feels like something's crawling under my skin." Thornhill made a decision. "I'm sending for Dr. Pritchard. You need medical attention whether you want it or not. And you're relieved of your duties until you're well enough to work. I'll manage the plantation myself until then." Hargrove wanted to argue, but he didn't have the strength. He just nodded and slumped back in his chair, his hand moving automatically to scratch his neck again. Dr. Samuel Pritchard arrived on December 9th, a respected physician from the nearby town of Statesboro. He was a man in his 50s, with grey hair and a neatly trimmed beard, dressed in the formal black suit that marked his profession. He carried a leather medical bag and had the calm, professional demeanor of someone who'd seen every kind of illness and injury imaginable. He examined Hargrove thoroughly, checking his pulse, looking at his eyes and throat, inspecting the infected scratches on his neck. He asked questions about Hargrove's symptoms, when they'd started, how they'd progressed, what made them better or worse. Hargrove answered in a dull, lifeless voice, as if he'd given up caring about his own condition. "It's an infection," Dr. Pritchard concluded. "Likely from those scratches they've gone septic. The question is, how did you get so many scratches in the first place?" "I don't know," Hargrove said. "I've been scratching. I can't help it. It itches." "But what caused the initial irritation?" Dr. Pritchard pressed. Did you come into contact with poison ivy? Were you bitten by something? Hargrove shook his head. I don't remember. It just started itching one day, and I couldn't stop scratching. Dr. Pritchard frowned. In his years of medical practice, he'd seen many cases of infected wounds, but this was unusual. The scratches were concentrated in one specific area, the back of Hargrove's neck, just below the hairline. They radiated out from a central point, as if Hargrove had been scratching one spot over and over until the skin broke, then continued scratching until the infection spread. I'll clean and dress the wounds, Dr. Pritchard said, and I'll leave you with laudanum for the pain and fever, but Mr. Hargrove, you must stop scratching. You're making it worse. If you can't control the urge, I'll need to bandage your hands. I can't stop, Hargrove said, his voice desperate. I've tried, but it itches. It burns. It feels like something's under my skin trying to get out. Dr. Pritchard cleaned the wounds with carbolic acid, a painful process that made Hargrove gasp and clench his fists. Then he applied a poultice and wrapped Hargrove's neck in clean bandages. He left instructions with Joseph about changing the bandages daily and gave Hargrove a bottle of laudanum with strict instructions about dosage. Rest, Dr. Pritchard said. Keep the wounds clean and dry. Don't scratch. If the infection doesn't improve in a few days, send for me again. But Hargrove couldn't follow those instructions. Within hours of Dr. Pritchard's departure, he'd torn off the bandages and scratched the wounds open again. The relief was immediate but temporary. The itching would subside for a few minutes, then return with renewed intensity, driving him to scratch again. By December 10th, the infection had spread. Red lines, the telltale signs of blood poisoning, were creeping up Hargrove's neck and down toward his chest. His fever had spiked, leaving him alternating between burning heat and bone-deep chills. He'd stopped making sense when he spoke, his words dissolving into fevered rambling. The enslaved community watched these developments with a mixture of fear and fascination. No one spoke openly about what was happening, but everyone understood that something significant was unfolding. Ruth had been dead for 6 days, and Hargrove was clearly dying, consumed by an infection that had started exactly where he'd been scratching, the same spot where his spit had landed on Ruth's neck. Word spread through the quarters in whispers. People would gather in small groups after dark, speaking in low voices about what they'd seen, what they'd heard. Some said it was divine justice, that God was punishing Hargrove for his cruelty. Others said it was Ruth herself, reaching back from beyond death to claim what was owed. A few of the older people, those who remembered Africa or had heard stories from their grandparents, spoke of different things, of debts and reckonings, of how cruelty could poison a man from the inside out, of how the dead sometimes demanded payment for wrongs done to them. Dinah listened to all these theories but said nothing. She remembered Ruth's last words, remembered the look in Ruth's eyes as she'd spoken them. Some debts get paid, whether you believe in the reckoning or not. Dinah didn't know if what was happening to Hargrove was supernatural or simply the natural consequence of infection and stress. But she knew that Ruth had seen something, had known something in those final moments. And whatever it was playing out now in Hargrove's suffering. On December 12th, Hargrove developed a new symptom. He couldn't bear to be touched. When Joseph tried to help him change his shirt, Hargrove recoiled violently, screaming that Joseph's hands were burning him. When Dr. Pritchard returned to check on his patient and tried to examine the infected wounds, Hargrove pushed him away with surprising strength, crying out that the doctor was trying to hurt him. He's delirious, Dr. Pritchard told Edmund Thornhill. The infection has spread to his blood. It's affecting his mind. He needs constant care, and he needs to be restrained if necessary to keep him from scratching. But restraining Hargrove proved impossible. He fought anyone who tried to tie his hands, thrashing and screaming with a strength that seemed impossible for someone so sick. Eventually, they gave up and simply left him alone in his cabin, checking on him periodically, but otherwise letting him do as he wished. The house slaves who had to enter his cabin to bring water or check on him reported strange things. They said Hargrove would sometimes be found standing at the window, staring out toward the slave quarters, muttering to himself. Other times he would be curled up on his bed, whimpering like a child, his hands pressed against his ears as if trying to block out sounds only he could hear. Once, Sarah found him on his knees in the middle of the cabin, his hands clasped as if in prayer, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he'd been saying over and over. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't understand." Sarah had backed out of the cabin quickly, disturbed by what she'd seen. She told the others about it that night, and the story spread through the quarters. Hargrove was apologizing. But to whom? To God? To Ruth? To all the people he'd tormented over the years? On December 14th, Edmund Thornhill insisted on bringing Dr. Pritchard back for another examination. The doctor arrived to find Hargrove in a terrible state. He'd lost more weight, his face was gaunt and gray, and his eyes had sunken deep into their sockets. The infection had spread across his entire neck and down onto his chest, angry red lines radiating out from the original scratches. The smell of sickness was overwhelming, sweat and infection and something else, something that made Dr. Pritchard think of rotting meat. "How long does he have?" Thornhill asked quietly, pulling the doctor aside. Dr. Pritchard shook his head. "Days at most. The infection is too advanced. It's in his blood now, spreading through his entire body. There's nothing more I can do." "How did this happen?" Thornhill demanded. "It was just scratches." Dr. Pritchard chose his words carefully. "Sometimes infections take hold in ways we don't fully understand. The body's humors become imbalanced. In Mr. Hargrove's case, I believe his mental state contributed to his physical decline. He was convinced someone was poisoning him, that he was being watched. That kind of fear and stress can weaken a man's constitution, make him susceptible to illness. What Dr. Pritchard didn't say, what he couldn't say without sounding like a superstitious fool, was that he'd never seen an infection progress quite like this. The pattern of it, the way it had spread from that single spot on Hargrove's neck, the timing of it all. It was unusual, not impossible, not supernatural, but unusual enough to make a man of science uncomfortable. That night, Dr. Pritchard sat in his office in Statesboro and wrote in his private journal, a record he kept of unusual cases. He described Hargrove's symptoms in detail, noted the progression of the infection, recorded his observations about the patient's mental state. Then he paused, pen hovering over the page, debating whether to include what he was thinking. Finally, he wrote, "There is something about this case that troubles me beyond the medical facts. The infection began in a very specific location, the back of the neck, just below the hairline. Mr. Hargrove was compulsively scratching this spot before any visible signs of infection appeared. When I asked him why he was scratching, he couldn't provide a clear answer. He simply said it itched, that it felt like something was under his skin. The enslaved workers at the plantation have been whispering about this case. They seem to believe there is some connection between Mr. Hargrove's illness and the recent death of an enslaved woman named Ruth. I do not put stock in superstition, but I cannot deny that the timing is striking. Ruth died on December 4th. Mr. Hargrove's symptoms began that same day. The infection is concentrated in the exact spot where witnesses say Mr. Hargrove spat on Ruth as she lay dying. I do not know what to make of this. Perhaps it is simply coincidence. Perhaps the stress of the incident triggered some psychosomatic response that manifested as physical symptoms. Or perhaps there are forces at work that medical science does not yet understand." Dr. Pritchard read over what he'd written, then closed the journal. He would never show this entry to anyone. Years later, after his death, his son would find the journal and read the entry. The son, also a doctor, would dismiss it as the superstitious musings of an aging physician. He would tear out the page and burn it, not wanting such unscientific speculation associated with his father's name. December 15th brought no improvement in Hargrove's condition. If anything, he was worse. The fever had reached dangerous levels, leaving him barely conscious. His skin had taken on a grayish tinge, and his breathing had become labored and irregular. The infection had spread to his face, causing swelling and discoloration around his jaw and cheeks. Joseph, who still brought water and checked on Hargrove several times a day, found the overseer lying on his bed, staring at the ceiling. Hargrove's lips were moving, but no sound was coming out. Joseph leaned closer, trying to hear what Hargrove was saying. "Watching me," Hargrove whispered. "Always watching. In the corner, by the window, standing at the foot of the bed, watching." "There's no one here, sir," Joseph said gently. "You're alone." "No," Hargrove said, his eyes still fixed on the ceiling. "She's here. She's always here now. Watching. Waiting." "Who, sir?" Joseph asked, though he already knew the answer. "Ruth," Hargrove whispered. "She won't leave. I tell her to leave, but she won't. She just stands there watching me. Sometimes she smiles, sometimes she just stares, but she's always there." Joseph felt a chill run down his spine. He looked around the cabin, seeing nothing but shadows and the dim light filtering through the window. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something there, some presence that he couldn't quite see or name. "I'm sorry," Hargrove said suddenly, his voice stronger. "Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I didn't mean it. Tell her to leave me alone." "Sir, there's no one here," Joseph said again. But Hargrove wasn't listening. His eyes had closed, and he'd fallen into a fitful sleep, his body twitching and jerking as if he were fighting something in his dreams. Joseph reported this conversation to the other house slaves, and word spread quickly through the quarters. The reaction was complex, satisfaction mixed with unease. They'd all wanted to see Hargrove punished for his cruelty, but watching him deteriorate into madness and infection was disturbing even to those who hated him most. Some felt vindicated, seeing his suffering as just payment for the pain he'd caused. Others felt uncomfortable, as if they were witnessing something that shouldn't be seen, something that crossed boundaries between the living and the dead. Dinah's reaction was different. When she heard about Hargrove's hallucinations, about him seeing Ruth standing in his cabin, she felt a strange sense of peace. Ruth had promised that debts would be paid, and now, it seemed, that promise was being fulfilled. Whether through divine intervention, supernatural forces, or simply the natural consequences of guilt and infection, Hargrove was facing a reckoning, and Ruth, in whatever form, was there to witness it. On December 18th, Hargrove began to hallucinate more intensely. Joseph, who still brought him meals that went uneaten, reported that Hargrove was having full conversations with people who weren't there. Sometimes he seemed to be arguing with someone, his voice rising in anger, gesturing wildly at empty air. Other times, he would fall silent, staring at a corner of the room as if watching something Joseph couldn't see, his face a mask of terror. "She's here," Hargrove said once, his eyes fixed on the empty corner. "She's always here now, watching, judging." "Who, sir?" Joseph asked, though he knew the answer. "Ruth," Hargrove whispered. "She won't leave. I tell her to leave, but she won't. She just stands there looking at me with those eyes, those terrible, knowing eyes." Joseph reported this to Edmund Thornhill, who was growing increasingly frustrated with the situation. His overseer was dying, Christmas was approaching, and he needed to find a replacement quickly. The plantation couldn't run itself, and Thornhill had no desire to manage it personally. He'd already begun making inquiries, reaching out to contacts in Savannah and Charleston, looking for someone who could take over Hargrove's duties. But finding a new overseer wasn't easy. Word had spread about Hargrove's illness, about the strange circumstances surrounding it. Some potential candidates were superstitious enough to be wary of taking a position where the previous overseer had died under such unusual circumstances. Others simply didn't want to deal with the complications of taking over mid-season, with Christmas approaching and the cotton already picked and baled. On December 20th, Hargrove could no longer get out of bed. The infection had spread throughout his body, and he was burning with fever. His skin had taken on a grayish tinge, and the smell of sickness had become overwhelming. The infected wounds on his neck had turned black in places, the tissue dying and rotting while he was still alive. Dr. Pritchard returned, took one look at Hargrove and pulled Edmund Thornhill aside. "There's nothing more I can do," the doctor said quietly. "The infection is too advanced. It's in his blood now, spreading through his entire body. He has days at most. You should prepare for the end." Thornhill was furious, not at Hargrove's impending death, but at the inconvenience of it. Christmas was in 5 days, traditionally a time when even enslaved people were given a few days of rest, and he needed to find a new overseer quickly. The plantation couldn't run itself, and he had no desire to spend his Christmas managing field hands and cotton production. "How did this happen?" Thornhill demanded. "It was just scratches. How does a man die from scratches?" "Doctor?" Pritchard shook his head. "Sometimes infections take hold in ways we don't fully understand. The body's humors become imbalanced. In Mr. Hargrove's case, I believe his mental state contributed to his physical decline. He was convinced someone was poisoning him, that he was being watched, that he was being punished for something. That kind of fear and stress can weaken a man's constitution, make him susceptible to illness. The mind and body are connected in ways we're only beginning to understand." What Dr. Pritchard didn't say, what he couldn't say without sounding like he believed in superstition, was that there was something deeply unsettling about this case. The timing, the location of the infection, the progression of symptoms, Hargrove's mental deterioration, all of it pointed to something beyond simple medical explanation. Not supernatural necessarily, but certainly unusual. In his years of practice, Dr. Pritchard had seen many people die, but he'd never seen anyone die quite like this. December 22nd brought a cold snap. Temperatures dropped below freezing, rare for coastal Georgia. Ice formed on the water troughs, and the enslaved workers huddled in their cabins, trying to stay warm with inadequate blankets and clothing. The cold seemed to seep into everything, making the already difficult conditions of plantation life even harder to bear. In his cabin, Hargrove was dying. He'd stopped speaking coherently, his words dissolving into fevered mumbling. The infection had spread to his face, causing swelling and discoloration that made him almost unrecognizable. His breathing was labored, each breath a struggle, a wet rattling sound that could be heard from outside the cabin. Edmund Thornhill stopped visiting. He couldn't stand the smell, couldn't stand watching his overseer reduced to this. He left instructions with Joseph to keep Hargrove comfortable and to inform him when the end came. Then he retreated to the main house, trying to focus on finding a replacement and managing the plantation's year-end accounts. On December 23rd, something strange happened. Hargrove, who'd been unconscious for nearly a day, suddenly opened his eyes. Joseph was in the cabin changing the water in the basin when he heard Hargrove speak. The voice was clear and strong, nothing like the fevered mumbling of the past days. "I'm sorry," Hargrove said. Joseph turned, startled. Hargrove was staring at the ceiling, tears running down his swollen face, cutting tracks through the grime and sweat. "I'm sorry," Hargrove said again, his voice breaking. "I didn't understand. I didn't know. I thought I was doing what needed to be done. I thought I was maintaining order, but I was wrong. I was so wrong." "Sir?" Joseph said, uncertain whether to respond. But Hargrove wasn't talking to Joseph. His eyes were fixed on something above him, something Joseph couldn't see. "Please," Hargrove whispered. "Please, I'm sorry. I understand now. I see what I've done. I see all of it. Every cruelty, every humiliation, every moment of suffering I caused. I see it all, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please, please make it stop. Make it stop." Then he began to scream. It was a sound Joseph would never forget. Pure terror. The sound of a man confronting something beyond his comprehension, something that stripped away every defense and left him naked and vulnerable. The screaming went on for nearly a minute, Hargrove's voice rising and falling, sometimes forming words but mostly just raw sound, the expression of fear so profound it couldn't be contained. The screaming brought people running. Sarah and 2 other house slaves burst into the cabin, followed moments later by Edmund Thornhill himself. They found Hargrove thrashing on the bed, his eyes wide and staring, his mouth open in a silent scream. His voice had given out, but his body continued to convulse as if he were still screaming. "Hold him down!" Thornhill shouted. "He'll hurt himself!" But when they tried to restrain Hargrove, he fought with surprising strength. It took 4 people to hold him down, and even then he continued to struggle, his eyes fixed on something above him, something only he could see. Finally, after what seemed like hours but was probably only a few minutes, Hargrove's body went limp. He collapsed back onto the bed, his breathing shallow and rapid, his eyes still open but no longer seeing. "What happened?" Thornhill demanded, looking at Joseph. "I don't know, sir," Joseph said, his voice shaking. He just started screaming. He was apologizing to someone, and then he started screaming. Thornhill looked down at Hargrove, at the infected wounds that covered his neck and chest, at the swollen face and sunken eyes. "He's dying," Thornhill said flatly. "Finally, Joseph, stay with him. Send for me when it's over." But Hargrove didn't die that night. He lingered through December 24th, Christmas Eve, in a state that was neither fully conscious nor unconscious. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, but he didn't react to anything around him. His breathing had become irregular, sometimes stopping for long seconds before resuming with a gasping wheeze. The house slaves, who had to enter his cabin to bring water or check on him, reported that his eyes would sometimes follow them, tracking their movements across the room. But he never spoke, never moved beyond the slight rise and fall of his chest. The plantation observed a subdued Christmas Eve. Traditionally, the enslaved people would have been given the evening off, allowed to gather and celebrate in their own way, to sing and dance and forget for a few hours the brutality of their daily lives. But with Hargrove dying and Thornhill in a foul mood, the atmosphere was tense and uncertain. People stayed in their cabins, speaking in whispers, waiting for news. Dinah spent Christmas Eve sitting outside her cabin, wrapped in a thin blanket, looking up at the stars. She thought about Ruth, about the last words Ruth had spoken, about the promise of a reckoning. She thought about Hargrove, dying slowly and painfully in his cabin, consumed by infection and guilt. And she wondered if this was justice, if this was what Ruth had meant when she'd said that debts get paid whether you believe in the reckoning or not. Just before midnight on Christmas Eve, a sound echoed across the plantation. It came from Hargrove's cabin, a long, rattling gasp, followed by silence. Joseph, who'd been dozing in a chair outside the cabin, jerked awake. He waited, listening, but heard nothing more. The silence stretched on, heavy and absolute. Slowly, Joseph stood and pushed open the cabin door. Hargrove was dead. His eyes were still open, staring at the ceiling, his mouth frozen in what might have been a scream or a plea. But it was his neck that made Joseph step back in shock. The infection, which had spread across Hargrove's body in angry red lines, had concentrated in one spot. The exact spot where he'd scratched compulsively for weeks, the same spot where his spit had landed on Ruth's neck. The skin there had turned black, necrotic, and had split open, revealing infected tissue beneath. The wound was deep, going down to the bone, and it had a smell that made Joseph gag, sweet and rotten, the smell of death. Joseph ran to get Edmund Thornhill. The plantation owner arrived with a lamp, took one look at Hargrove's body, and immediately sent for Dr. Pritchard. The doctor arrived just after dawn on Christmas morning, examined the body, and began to fill out the death certificate. "Cause of death?" Thornhill asked, his voice clipped and businesslike. Dr. Pritchard hesitated. He looked at Hargrove's neck, at the concentrated infection, at the pattern of it. In his medical training, he'd learned that infections could spread in unpredictable ways, that the human body was complex and not fully understood. But he'd also learned that some things were better left unexplained, especially in a community where superstition ran deep and people were already whispering about curses and divine justice. "Septicemia," Dr. Pritchard said finally. "Blood poisoning from an infected wound." He wrote this on the death certificate, signed it, and handed it to Thornhill. But as he was packing his medical bag, he paused. "Mr. Thornhill, may I ask?" "The woman who died earlier this month. Ruth, I believe her name was. What was the cause of her death?" Thornhill shrugged, already thinking about the arrangements he'd need to make, the new overseer he'd need to hire. "Pneumonia, I suppose, or consumption. Does it matter?" "No," Dr. Pritchard said slowly. "I suppose it doesn't. But it did matter, at least to Dr. Pritchard. That night, in his private journal, he wrote about Hargrove's death. He noted the progression of the infection, the location of it, the timing. He also noted, though he couldn't explain why it seemed significant, that Hargrove had died exactly 21 days after Ruth's death, and that the infection had concentrated in the exact spot where Hargrove had scratched. The same spot where witnesses said he'd spat on Ruth as she lay dying. Dr. Pritchard never showed this journal entry to anyone. Years later, after his death, his son found the journal and read the entry. The son, also a doctor, dismissed it as the superstitious musings of an aging physician. He tore out the page and burned it, not wanting such unscientific speculation associated with his father's name. But before he burned it, he read the final line his father had written. "There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy. I do not know what killed Silas Hargrove, but I am not certain it was simply infection." Silas Hargrove was buried on December 26, 1854, in the White Cemetery in Statesboro, far from the plantation and far from the unmarked graves of the people he'd tormented. The funeral was sparsely attended. Edmund Thornhill, Dr. Pritchard, a few local businessmen who felt obligated to pay their respects, and the minister who performed the service. No one from the plantation attended except Joseph, who was required to drive Thornhill's carriage. The minister's eulogy was brief and generic, speaking of a man taken too soon, of the mysteries of God's will, of the hope of resurrection. But his words rang hollow. Everyone there knew what kind of man Hargrove had been. No one mourned his passing. The burial was simply a formality, a social obligation, a way of disposing of a body and moving on. Back at Thornhill Plantation, life continued. Edmund Thornhill hired a new overseer, a man named Crawford, who came with similar references to Hargrove's, but who, perhaps having heard about his predecessor's fate, proved to be marginally less cruel. He was still an overseer, still enforcing a brutal system, still using violence and intimidation to maintain control. But he was careful. He never destroyed anyone's garden. He never spat on anyone, and when someone fell ill, he allowed them rest, at least for a day or two. The enslaved community returned to their work, their lives, their quiet resistance. But something had changed. In the weeks and months following Hargrove's death, people noticed small things. The cabin where Hargrove had died remained empty. No one wanted to live there, and Thornhill didn't force the issue. Workers who passed it at night sometimes reported hearing sounds from inside, though when investigated the cabin was always empty. Scratching sounds, they said, like someone clawing at wood, desperate to get out or to get at something beneath the surface. More significantly, the story of what had happened spread beyond the plantation. In the enslaved community across Georgia, it became a story told in whispers, a story that carried both warning and hope. The details changed with each telling. Some versions made Ruth a conjure woman with special powers. Others made Hargrove's death more dramatic, more obviously supernatural. But the core remained the same. A woman had been shown the ultimate disrespect in her dying moments, and the man who'd done it had died in agony exactly 3 weeks later, consumed by an infection that started in the exact spot where he'd committed his final act of cruelty. Edmund Thornhill never spoke publicly about Hargrove's death. In his private correspondence, discovered years later by historians, he mentioned it only once, in a letter to a business associate dated January 15, 1855. "The overseer situation has been resolved. The new man is adequate. though perhaps too cautious. I sometimes wonder if Hargrove's death has made him superstitious. These rural folk are prone to such nonsense. Still, productivity is acceptable, and I suppose a cautious overseer is better than a dead one. But Thornhill's own behavior suggested he wasn't entirely immune to that nonsense. After Hargrove's death, he spent less time at the plantation, preferring his townhouse in Savannah. When he did visit, he avoided the slave quarters and never went near Hargrove's old cabin. In 1858, he sold the plantation entirely and moved to Charleston, citing business opportunities. Those who knew him said he seemed eager to leave Georgia behind, as if the place held bad memories he wanted to escape. The Thornhill plantation changed hands several times before the Civil War. During the war, it was briefly used as a Confederate supply depot, then burned by Sherman's troops during the March to the Sea in 1864. After the war, the land was divided and sold off in parcels. The main house was never rebuilt. Today, the site is mostly farmland, with a few scattered houses and a historical marker that mentions the plantation's existence, but says nothing about the people who lived and died there. Nothing about Ruth or Hargrove or the events of December 1854. But the story persisted. In the 1930s, as part of the Federal Writers Project, interviewers collected oral histories from formerly enslaved people. Several of these interviews, conducted with elderly men and women who'd been children during slavery, mentioned the story of Ruth and Hargrove. The details varied. Some remembered it happening in Georgia, others placed it in South Carolina or Alabama. Some said the overseer died on Christmas Day, others said it was New Year's. But the core was always the same. An overseer had spat on a dying enslaved woman, and he'd died shortly after, consumed by an infection that started where his spit had landed. One interview, conducted in 1937 with a woman named Clara Jenkins, is particularly striking. Clara was 93 years old at the time of the interview, living in a small house outside Atlanta. She'd been born on a plantation near Thornhill, and had heard the story from her mother, who'd heard it from someone who'd been there when it happened. "My mama told me about that overseer," Clara said in the interview, her voice still strong despite her age. "Said he was a mean man, meanest she ever heard of. And there was this woman, Ruth was her name, who knew about healing and such. She could cure fevers, help with birthing, set bones. People depended on her. But this overseer, he hated her. Hated that people looked to her instead of to him. So he made her life miserable, destroyed her garden, had her whipped, worked her when she was sick. And when she was dying, when she could barely stand, he spat on her. Spat on her like she was nothing, like she was less than human." Clara paused, her eyes distant, as if she were seeing something from long ago. "My mama said that woman, even dying, she looked at him with eyes that saw everything, that knew everything. And she said something. Nobody heard what, but she said something. And that man, he started scratching his neck right where he'd spat on her. Scratched it till it bled. Scratched it till it got infected. Scratched it till it killed him. My mama said it was 21 days exactly. 3 weeks. And she said that's how long it takes for a debt like that to come due." The interviewer, a young white woman from Atlanta, asked Clara if she believed the story was true. Clara looked at her for a long moment before answering. "I believe there's things in this world we don't understand," she said slowly. "I believe cruelty has a cost. Whether that cost comes from God or from something else, I can't say, but I believe it comes. I've seen it in my own life, seen cruel people suffer in ways that seemed like more than just bad luck. I don't know if it's divine justice or karma, or just the way the world works. But I believe that what you put out into the world comes back to you, one way or another." The interviewer pressed further. "But do you think the woman, Ruth, actually caused the overseer's death? Through some kind of curse or magic?" Clara shook her head. "I don't know about curses or magic. My mama didn't believe in that kind of thing, and neither do I. But I believe in consequences. I believe that when you treat people with cruelty, when you strip away their humanity and grind them down, something happens. Maybe it's guilt eating at you from the inside. Maybe it's stress weakening your body. Maybe it's just that cruel people make enemies, and eventually those enemies find a way to strike back. Or maybe there's something else, something we don't have words for. All I know is that Overseer spat on a dying woman, and 3 weeks later he was dead, killed by an infection that started right where he'd spat. You can call that coincidence if you want. But my mama didn't think it was coincidence, and neither do I. Modern historians who've studied the Thornhill Plantation have found some documentation of these events. The plantation records now housed in the Georgia Historical Society archives in Savannah show that an enslaved woman named Ruth died on December 4, 1854. The entry is brief. Ruth, field hand, age 38, died of fever. There's no other information, no details about her life or her death. Just that single line in the ledger. The records also show that the overseer Silas Hargrove died on December 25, 1854. Again, the entry is brief. Silas Hargrove, overseer, died of infection. Dr. Pritchard's death certificate, filed with the county clerk, lists the cause of death as septicemia, blood poisoning from an infected wound. What the records don't show, what can never be proven or disproven, is the connection between these two deaths. Was it simply coincidence? A cruel overseer who happened to develop a fatal infection shortly after the death of a woman he'd tormented? Or was it something more, some mechanism of justice or retribution that operated outside the bounds of law and science? Medical historians have offered explanations. Septicemia was common in the 19th century, especially in cases where wounds became infected. Hargrove's compulsive scratching could have introduced bacteria into his bloodstream. The stress of his position, his poor diet, his general health, all of these could have contributed to his body's inability to fight the infection. There's nothing supernatural about a man dying from blood poisoning. It happened all the time in that era, before antibiotics and modern medicine, but the timing remains striking. 21 days, 3 weeks exactly. And the location of the infection, concentrated in the exact spot where Hargrove had scratched, the same spot where his spit had landed on Ruth's neck. Coincidence? Possibly. Probably even. But it's the kind of coincidence that makes people uncomfortable, that makes them wonder if there are patterns in the world that we don't fully understand. There's another detail, one that's often overlooked in retellings of the story. In the weeks before Ruth's death, several people mentioned seeing her working on something. She would sit outside her cabin in the evenings when the day's work was done, working with plants and roots. When asked what she was making, she'd smile and say it was for later. After her death, when the women cleaned out her cabin, they found several small bundles of herbs and roots, carefully wrapped and labeled. Most were familiar: feverfew for headaches, willow bark for pain, chamomile for sleep, yarrow for bleeding. These were the remedies Ruth had used for years, the knowledge passed down through generations. But there was one bundle that no one recognized. It contained a mixture of roots and dried plants that none of the other healers in the community could identify. The plants weren't from Ruth's destroyed garden. They were different, unfamiliar, possibly gathered from the woods beyond the plantation boundaries. The bundle was labeled in Ruth's careful handwriting with a single word: justice. The women who found it were frightened. Some wanted to burn it immediately, afraid of what it might represent. Others argued it should be buried with Ruth, that it was meant to go with her to the grave. In the end, they did neither. They hid it, placing it in a small wooden box and burying it near Ruth's grave, marking the spot with a flat stone so they could find it again if needed. Whether this bundle had anything to do with Hargrove's death is impossible to say. Ruth never used it, never had the opportunity to use it. It was simply there, a preparation for something that never came to pass, at least not in any way that could be directly traced. Ruth died before she could do anything with whatever she'd prepared. Or perhaps it did come to pass, just not in the way anyone expected. Perhaps the act of preparation itself was enough, a declaration of intent that somehow manifested in the world. Perhaps Ruth's knowledge of plants and roots extended beyond simple healing, into areas that modern science doesn't fully understand. Or perhaps, and this is what most historians would argue, it was simply a dying woman's attempt to maintain some sense of control, some belief that justice might eventually be served, even if she wouldn't live to see it. The truth, as with so many stories from this period, is lost to time. What remains are the documented facts. Ruth died on December 4th, 1854. Silas Hargrove died on December 25th, 1854, exactly 21 days later, from an infection that began in the spot where he'd scratched compulsively, the same spot where witnesses said he'd spat on Ruth as she lay dying. These are facts, recorded in plantation ledgers and death certificates and county records. Everything else, the meaning of it, the connection between these events, the question of whether this was justice or coincidence, that's for you to decide. Was it divine intervention? Was it a curse? Some form of folk magic that Ruth had learned from her ancestors? Was it simply the natural consequence of guilt and stress manifesting as physical illness? Or was it pure coincidence, two unrelated deaths that happened to occur in close proximity, with no connection beyond the one we impose on them through storytelling? The people who lived through these events had their own opinions. The enslaved community at Thornhill believed that Ruth had somehow reached back from death to claim what was owed. They believed that Hargrove's suffering was payment for his cruelty, that justice had been served even if it came through mysterious means. This belief sustained them, gave them hope that even in a world designed to strip away their humanity, there was still some force that recognized their worth, that punished those who treated them with contempt. The white community had different explanations. Dr. Pritchard believed it was a medical case, unusual but explainable through the science of the time. Edmund Thornhill believed it was bad luck, an unfortunate coincidence that cost him a good overseer. The minister who performed Hargrove's funeral service believed it was God's will, though he was careful not to speculate on why God might have chosen to take Hargrove in such a painful manner. But there were some, even in the white community, who wondered, who noticed the timing, the location of the infection, the progression of Hargrove's symptoms, who remembered the stories their grandmothers had told them about curses and hexes, about folk magic that could reach across the boundary between life and death, who looked at the facts and couldn't quite convince themselves that it was all just coincidence. In the end, perhaps the truth doesn't matter as much as what the story represents. It's a story about power and powerlessness, about cruelty and consequences, about the human need to believe that justice exists even when the law provides none. It's a story that was told and retold for generations, changing with each telling, but always maintaining its core, that some debts get paid, whether you believe in the reckoning or not. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Was this divine justice, a biological coincidence, or something else entirely? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories like this, stories pulled from forgotten archives and sealed records, stories that make you question what's possible, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this with someone who loves mysteries. These stories need to be told, need to be remembered. The people who lived them, who suffered and died in systems designed to erase their humanity, deserve to have their stories preserved. See you in the next video.